Congressman Bobby Scott from the 3rd District of Virginia. Congressman Scott, great to have you with us, sir.
John, it's good to be with you again.
Now, the first question, sir, we have is earlier today we started to bomb a sovereign nation. How is this not war?
Well, we authorized the well, first of all, we're responding to the horrific deaths of two Americans, and I mean, I think you have to put our actions in that category. In terms of the legal authority, I think they're going back through the 2001, 2002 authorizations, and I think that's a stretch. We need to repeal those two authorizations. People keep referring to them. They're 13 years old, and if we're going to make new attacks, we need to make them based on a new authorization. We passed a authorization to arm the Syrian opposition, which have been fighting against ISIS, but the new attacks, I think, are problematic in terms of legality. We need to, if we're going to have new attacks, we need to have a new authorization. In this case, I think they're justified, but we need a new authorization to clear up any ambiguity as to the legality.
Right, and there's definitely ambiguity out there. Now, Congressman Scott, if we turn the clock back in time, both you and I were very lonely people back during the invasion, the George W. Bush invasion of Iraq. We were two of only, it seemed like, a handful of people in the world, in the United States, that were opposed to that war. Why is this different?
Well, I think we had with Iraq, I think the facts were clear, and I think a majority of the Democrats in Congress, in fact, opposed the war. I mean, we weren't out there by ourselves, but the facts, I think, were there. There was no evidence that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11, and they tried to, although they claim never to have claimed that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. They were always in the same. 9/11 was always in the same sentence with the reason to attack Iraq. The question of whether they had weapons of mass destruction was problematic. That was unclear, and we were doing inspections. If we had waited a couple of weeks, we could have found out that they had no weapons of mass destruction. The inspections were going well. All we had to do was wait and see, and we would have found out that there were no weapons of mass destruction.
Yes.
And if they had found weapons of mass destruction, it would have made for we would have been better off because we would have known where to bomb.
Right.
We ended up just bombing anything. So, I mean, there's no justification. They hadn't done anything to us. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and we knew that. With the ISIS situation, there are things that are much less clear, other than the fact that they killed 2 Americans. They captured and killed 2 Americans, and killed them in just a barbaric way. And I think some response is appropriate against them, because they have essentially attacked defenseless Americans.
Now, Congressman Scott, many military advisors are telling us that there's no way that we can defeat this organization without combat troops on the ground. What say you?
Well, one thing that I think is important in this in last night's attack was that we have a fairly robust coalition, including several Middle Eastern countries. That's something we didn't have going into Iraq, and haven't had in a long time. I think the diplomatic efforts with Secretary of State John Kerry, President and Vice President, have created a coalition of several Middle Eastern states, which adds a great deal of legitimacy to the operation, something we didn't have before.
but we have no commitment of any of these organizations. I'm sorry, of any of these countries formulating the coalition that they're going to supply ground troops. So at the end of the day, aren't we going to be the ones that are going to have to put our young men and women in there if we're actually going to defeat ISIS?
The strategy is not to use American ground troops. You're right. I think there's a consensus that ground troops will be needed. Hopefully, the others will provide the ground troops. I think that's it. I think it's going to be difficult to avoid ground troops at the end. And if you have advisors there, you're going to have troops to protect the advisors, to supply the advisors, and if anybody gets attacked, we're not going to leave them high and dry. We're going to go in and protect them. So the risk of ground troops, I think, is something we have to acknowledge.
Well, I think you're right.
But the other thing is, you're almost compelled to do something. And ISIS is, I think, is intentionally provoking.
Yes.
I mean, when after the United States indicated an effort to get a coalition together to take action in Great Britain, they were having a debate. Yes, we should. No, we shouldn't. They're going back and forth, and it was unclear what they were going to do until they beheaded a British journalist, and their debate stopped. I mean, I think that was fairly predictable that the debate stopped, and that yes, count them in. You can't do that to people and think nothing's going to happen, and so one of the things you have to be careful about is that the people doing it are actually the people that you're going after. I mean, you could imagine somebody setting up a situation, blaming it on somebody else, and then sitting aside as you attack the wrong people. So yeah, I think we have to make sure that it's the right people, because their strategy is so bizarre. Attacking Americans and British innocent civilians, and think somebody's going to sit aside and not respond. You just wonder what their strategy is. But you have to have a response to convey to them the message that was a mistake.
Well, we're certainly responding now. Common Sense News Time, 7:46. John Frederick Show across Virginia. We're with the Democratic congressman from Virginia's 3rd District, Bobby Scott. Congressman, you mentioned earlier, you said we kind of hope that the coalition in the Middle East will supply ground troops, but as you know, hope isn't a strategy. So if they do not do that, I think what you're saying is inevitably we're going to get sucked in, right?
Well, not necessarily. We can stop with airstrikes. I mean, that's part of the strategy. The strategy is to try to avoid at all costs getting drawn into a ground war. And if you just stop at airstrikes and do nothing other than airstrikes, you can make quite a difference. I mean, these people have to train somewhere, and every time they set up a training camp, you drop bombs on them. It makes it very difficult for them to organize. And I think a great deal of damage can be done, and from what I understand already, was done last night. Mm-hmm. And you can inflict a lot of damage with airstrikes. Now, I agree with you that you can't totally complete
right.
The deal without some ground troops. But if you stop without that, and just maintain as every time they try to get together, strike again, you can inflict enough damage, and hopefully if we pursue that with the coalition working with us, we can inflict a great deal of damage and convey the message that killing 2 Americans the way they killed them was a mistake.
Congressman Scott, do you think in retrospect our drawdown in Iraq was a mistake?
Well, I think no. At some point, we were going to withdraw from Iraq, and at that point, things could fall apart. That should have happened. We never should have gone in to begin with.
Right.
And then having gone in without an exit strategy, whenever you exit, if we'd stayed there 2 more years and then withdrawn, it would have fallen apart then. or we could have stuck around for 8 more years, and it would have fallen apart then. I mean, it's as soon as you withdraw, it's going to fall apart. So I mean, the question is, when are you going to? You should have done that if you had done that 10 years ago. It would have fallen apart 10 years ago. It was going to fall apart as soon as we withdrew. Once we destabilized the country, we had a mess. And the only thing worse than Saddam Hussein was nobody.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we're in total agreement that going in there was one of the biggest follies in history.
Okay, so when you say when we withdrew the troops, things fell apart. Yeah, well, that was going to happen when next year. If I stay there 5 more years, then withdraw, fall apart. 20 more years, fall apart. I mean, at some point, you just have to accept the fact that you created a big mess, and you're going to have to pay the consequences. And we could have just dragged it out a few more years. The president, I think, closed it out about as well as could be done. But everybody knew that you had a mess behind as soon as we came out. You had a mess with when we were in there.
You voted with the administration to arm the so-called Syrian moderate rebels. I read your statement. It didn't seem you were enthusiastic about making that decision. And
I think I talked to a reporter who asked me how I voted, and I said, "Well, I voted yes." And the reporter remarked, "That's how everybody's answering." It was not an easy vote, and there was too much we didn't know, because usually have some idea of what's going to happen after you do something. In this case, we really didn't. ISIS, we don't even know what the rebels are going to do. They're more. They appear as interested in fighting Assad as ISIS, and so we're going to arm them and hope they. One of the part of when they say properly vetted. Anybody we give arms to will have to be committed to fighting ISIS and not Assad. But there's so much going on in the Middle East that anything you do, just about every country is in the middle of a civil war. So and virtually everybody is somebody else's enemy, and so anybody you hurt helps somebody that's probably your enemy. And there's just so much conflict over there that anything you do has a huge potential of just backfiring. And so, I was reluctant. One of the things I was that I think was important was that the president was in the process of putting together a coalition that looked promising. In fact, he has a pretty good coalition now, and it's a little awkward for him to be trying to talk people into joining a coalition when his Congress is causing him problems. One of the allies that was participating last night, I was reading one article, questioned whether the United States was actually serious. They're not going to join a coalition, and the president's not going to follow through. Is he serious about doing it? And I think one of the problems with a no vote was it would alert everybody to the idea that maybe you don't want to join this because you're going to get all the downside of joining a coalition, and then the United States isn't going to do anything. So I think that was a problem. The idea that the strategy is no ground troops, I think, was an important consideration. But as you said, once you get into a war, things can happen. And so you don't know, but that's the strategy going in. And so it wasn't an easy vote. I mean, you could have said, well, let's just let them behead a couple of Americans and let's not do anything. Maybe it'll go away. I'm not sure that's not a good idea either.
What is the administration's obsession with taking out Assad and going into Damascus when essentially Assad should be our ally? We have a common enemy, which is ISIS. I don't understand. What is the obsession here?
Well, the problem with the Middle East today is it used to be the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, there's so much stuff going on in the Middle East now that the enemy of your enemy is also your enemy, and the enemy of your enemy, all of them are your enemies. I mean, that's on one chart that charted all the Middle Eastern countries across the top and the bottom, and who's fighting who, and everybody was everybody's enemy. So anything you do over there has the potential of backfiring, because if you hurt one group, you're helping the people that their enemy, and that's also your enemy. So you've essentially empowered him. It is a total mess over there, and that's one of the that's one thing that actually recommends just stay out.
Yeah, I think we should stay out.
Don't get in the middle of it.
So then why are we arming a faction of rebels that we don't even know who the leader is? Well,
and one of the problems is, what are their priorities? And some of the ISIS, I understand they're using weapons, American-made weapons that they got from somebody else. So once you put weapons in there, I mean, I agree with you. That's why what you're saying is why it was not an easy vote.
Right.
But the alternative, I mean, when you've got all that going on, all the alternatives are bad. Doing nothing, I think, leaves a lot to be desired.
Okay, I don't agree with your decision, but I do have to say, Congressman, that is a very sober answer.